In this video, we'll talk about seventh chords, what they are. In specific, we'll focus our discussion on dominant seventh chords and how to do inversions of these seventh chords. First, a triad. As you'll remember, a triad simply is a chord that involves two superimposed thirds. So there are three notes to a triad. Here I've given you an example of our old friend, the C major triad, C, E, G. If instead of three notes we have four notes and they form three superimposed thirds rather than only two, right? Like in this case here, we have a third between C and D, another third between E and G, and a third between G and B. Then that we call a seventh chord. Another way of looking at a seventh chord and why it is called a seventh chord, because it is a triad, and then there's a seventh over the root of that triad. Right? Either way you look at it, that's how they look like. The seventh chord members are called, just like the triad members are, root, third, and fifth, and then the seventh over the root is simply called seventh. And then the chord positions that we use, the names that we use for those, are the same as before. Soprano is the highest note. Here my soprano is G, here my soprano is B. Alto and tenor are the inner voices, depending on the context. Here I only have one inner voice, here I have two. And the bass is the lowest voice, always, in any given chord or triad. Here you have C and C, the root here being the base of both of these chords. Like triads, seventh chords also have qualities, but they work in a slightly different manner. We define the qualities of seventh chords by using two qualifiers. The first is the quality of the triad. So we need to know how to calculate those well. And if you're unsure or not as comfortable with that, my previous couple of videos, I think, deal with this idea of how to find or calculate the quality of a triad, right? By calculating the quality of the thirds that make up that triad. Once you got that figured out, then you have to calculate the seventh in relation to the root, right? So in this example that I gave you here in the previous slide, what you have is a C major triad. And then on top of that, from C to B, you have a seventh that contains 11 semitones between them, and that is a major seventh. So you have a major triad with a major seventh from the root to that seventh. So this is technically called a major seventh chord. Major triad dash major seventh chord, right? Just for the sake of contrast, here's a different type of seventh chord on the same root on C, and in this particular case, middle C. I've changed E to E flat, so now instead of E major, I have E minor, right? C to E flat minor third, E flat to G major third. That's the recipe of a minor triad. And I've changed from B to B flat, so I've shortened the distance from the root to the seventh from 11 semitones to 10 semitones. And that makes for a minor seventh. So I have a minor triad with a minor seventh there between root and seventh. And that particular seventh chord is called a minor seventh chord. Minor triad dash minor seventh chord. As we'll see very shortly, these names are kind of a mouthful to say, right? A major seventh chord. And they're used, they're correct, they're technical and they're correct, but they're used only when you want to be unambiguous about whatever you're talking about these chords. They have abbreviated names, actually, which are these. A major seventh chord is most commonly called a major seventh chord, simply major seventh chord. That already implies major triad with a major seventh chord. And a minor seventh chord is simply called a minor seventh chord. That already implies minor triad with a minor seventh. If I choose a major scale, and for the sake of clarity and ease, I've chosen C major because that contains no accidentals in the key signature. And you build seventh chords on each of the scale degrees, right? These are the qualities of the seventh chords you'll find. A major seventh chord will be built on 1 and 4, as you can see here. Major triads with major sevenths over the roots of those triads. Minor seventh chords will be built on 2, 3, and 6. Ironically, in major scales, minor seventh chords are the most common type of seventh chords. And then you have on the dominant this very special seventh chord, which is a major triad with a minor seventh on top of it, right? As we've talked previously when we discussed keys, for example, in which scale degrees form specific relationships among themselves that kind of evince what the key is, right? And what the roles are of each of these scale degrees, in that 1, or tonic, is a place of home and relaxation, and 5 is the opposition of that, is tension and a yearning to go back to that place of relaxation or repose, or 1. This seventh chord happening only once, this specific quality of seventh chord, right? The major minor seventh chord happens only once in a major scale, and it happens to happen on this very important scale degree 5. This makes it so that the dominant seventh chord is a really special sort of seventh chord. There are other reasons too. For example, as the relationship between 5 and 1 is one that dictates that we have to move from 5 back to 1. There's this yearning once we arrive at 5 to go back to 1. You can see that it features here the leading tone, right? B in this case, that has a very strong pull to 1, to C. And also there's this F, which is just a semitone above E, the third of that tonic chord, or that tonic triad. So there's this sort of double leading tone, quote-unquote, relationship of a dominant seventh chord that makes it really special. And the other type of seventh chord that we encounter naturally in a major scale is built on scale degree 7, on the leading tone, where you have a minor triad, a diminished triad with a minor seventh on top of it, right? So this is a diminished minor seventh chord, more commonly referred to as the half diminished seventh chord. The reason for this term here, half, will become apparent very soon, right? So if I have my major scale, and then I build the seventh chords on top of each of the scale degrees, I have right? Now listen just to the alternation here between the dominant seventh going to a tonic triad rather than a tonic seventh chord, right? There's this very, here it is once again, I'm changing the order of the chord members. There's this very satisfying, rewarding sonority to this alternation here, especially from going from the dominant seventh, this very special chord, back towards a tonic triad. In minor keys, there's a little caveat. We can do the same experiment, right? And I would choose a minor scale that has no accidentals in the key signature. A minor. But as we're building seventh chords on the scale degrees of a minor scale, in this case of A minor, we have to use the harmonic minor scale variant when we are building the seventh chord on scale degree 5, dominant, and on scale degree 7, which will become the raised scale degree 7, the leading tone seventh chord, rather than the subtonic seventh chord. There really isn't a subtonic seventh chord. When that happens, usually we're looking at a modulation to a relative key, right? So a subtonic seventh chord really happens in a context that is not typically of A minor per se. So when we're building seventh chords on scale degree 5 and 7, we need to use that raised 7th scale degree that comes from the harmonic minor scale. Every other chord doesn't need that, right? So in consequence of that, we have minor 7th chords built on scale degrees 1 and 4. We have a half diminished 7th chord, that is a diminished triad with a minor 7th built on scale degree 2. We have two major 7th chords built on scale degree 3 and 6. And then on scale degree 5, because of that raised 7th scale degree, we're going to have a major triad with a minor 7th, in other words, a dominant 7th chord built, you've guessed it, on the dominant. And then on the leading tone on the raised 7th scale degree, you will have a diminished triad with a diminished 7th. That makes for a fully diminished 7th chord. Right? So the half diminished being a diminished triad with a minor 7th chord, the fully diminished being a diminished triad with a diminished 7th. Here's how they look in the key of A minor. You'll see that I'm using G sharp, which is the key's 7th scale degree, raised by a semitone, on the construction or the formation here of the 7th chords on the dominant, scale degree 5, and on the leading tone, the raised 7th scale degree, right? You can see that I'm using G natural for the other 7th chords here, because I really don't need to raise. The harmonic minor is only invoked, so to speak, in building the 7th chords on 5 and on sharp 7, right? So you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, then the 5 with a raised 7, which is G sharp in this case, 6, and then the raised 7, back to 1. Right? Really important. What is really cool about the fully diminished chord, specifically here how it is found on the minor scale, right? Where we're using the harmonic minor to build it here on scale degree 7, is that we've talked about the importance of the tritone, which has been so important in the harmony of Western music over the past, I don't know, millennium or so. The tritone being the most complex of the simple intervals, right? The intervals contained in an octave between unison and the octave. And the most dissonant or intriguing of all of those intervals because of that. Here we have between G sharp and D a diminished fifth, that is a tritone, right? 6 semitones between them. And between B and F, we have another tritone, right? So we have here a diminished fifth, 6 semitones, 3 tones. So in this chord, we have 2 tritones superimposed, one over the other. This makes for a very interesting sound, right? A very intriguing and very dissonant sound. Of course, over the years, it has become sort of cliche because it was used a lot for expressive reasons in romantic music of the 19th century and before as well, but really explored in the romantic music. And then when film music appeared and composers were drawing on that literature of the 19th century, they really explored the possibilities, the expressive possibilities here of the fully diminished 7th chord. Also, like triads, a 7th chord does not need to appear neatly, like in a textbook example here, in root position. Any of its chord members can take the lowest position, that is the base of the chord, in which case the 7th chord may appear in root position or in any of 3 inversions. When the base is the root, it's in root position. When the base, the lowest note, is the 3rd, here I've given you D dominant 7th chords, then it's said to be in first inversion. F sharp is the 3rd, F sharp is at the bottom, so this is D dominant 7th in first inversion. When the 5th is in the bottom, is the bass, then we have it in second inversion. D dominant 7th with the bass here on A. And then we have this additional inversion, the third inversion, which we didn't have with triads because we only had 3 notes. Because now we have 4 notes, we have 4 possible different basses. Here the 7th is the bass when we have in third inversion. In this case, it's D dominant 7th with the C here at the bottom. Like before, judging the inversion, right, or the root position of a 7th chord, once you figure out what the 7th chord is and what is its root and etc., the quality, etc., judging the inversion depends only on the bass, only at the lowest note. That's where you have to look at. We also have conventions here for figured bass and chord symbols, how to notate or indicate a particular configuration of a dominant 7th chord. Back to those same chords we've seen previously. We use the superscript 7 in both figured bass and the rock and jazz chord symbols to indicate a dominant 7th chord. We use 6/5 to indicate first inversion. You'll see that that's the interval made between the lowest note and then the top and then the second note here, a 6th and a 5th. Or, in the very matter of fact and kind of very objective and concrete way the chord symbols work, we notate D7/ the name of the lowest note. In this case, it is the third of the chord, F sharp, D7/F sharp. For second inversions, we use 4/3, because if you see here, the lowest note makes a 4th with the second note and the third with a third note here, right? Or, in chord symbol tradition, D7/ the name of the lowest note, A, which in this case is the 5th. And for third inversion, we can use 4/2 or simply a 2. So here we have D4/2, like that, or D2, or D7/ the name of the lowest note, in this case C, which is the 7th of that 7th chord. So I have, once again, some steps for us to go over if we are given a real-life example, a score, or you're playing something, or you know the notes of something, and you need to find out what is the 7th chord, is it inverted, is it not, what inversion is it, etc. First step is tally up all of the notes that you're seeing. Second, you're going to cross out the doublings, and if you really have a 7th chord in there, only 4 note names should remain. Your next job will be to arrange those 4 note names, those 4 notes, as 3 superimposed thirds. That's how you find what the root is, and the root will give you the name of the chord. The qualities of the thirds, which means the quality of the triad you find, and the quality of the 7th that you form between the root and the note that will be a 7th above that, will determine the quality of your 7th chord. And then you have to add figured bass or chord symbols according to the chord's lowest note, the bass. Here's an example that I found from the opening of Beethoven's Symphony No. 6, the Pastoral Symphony. I've provided a link in the description for you to listen to that if you'd like to. There's another layer of complexity here, in that this cell here, contained within a single 2/4 measure, is repeated over and over and over again in the introduction. I think it's repeated 8 or 10 times. It's a lot of times there. And just this exact same thing. But it contains notes that do not belong to the chord in question, right? So these notes are notes that I have circled or put in a box. A, I'm not going to include that in my tally of all of the possible notes because this is a non-harmonic tone. It does not belong to the harmony, to the chord that we're looking at. It is rather connecting two harmonic tones, G and B flat. Notice the key signature, G and B flat. So I'm not including A in my counting here. And these 3 notes here, B natural, outside the key signature, F and D, right, played by the first, second violins and the viola, this is what we called a group of non-harmonic tones or a non-harmonic chord, right? So I'm not including those either. That's partly the difficulty of analyzing a chord in a given passage. Sometimes it's really straightforward, like in our previous videos, but sometimes you have to weed out what belongs to that particular chord and what doesn't, right? And part of the training in music theory is knowing what constitutes, say, a non-harmonic tone like this A here, which is a passing tone connecting two harmonic tones. And what is a non-harmonic chord here? What function it serves. So we're going to get into that in a further discussion, right? So you don't have to worry too much about it. But just, I'd like to show you this example because when we're seeing what the harmony or the chord is of a given passage of music, sometimes we're going to have notes that do not belong to that. And part of the training is spotting those notes and not including that in our tally. So if I don't include those non-harmonic tones in our tally, what we have is this: C, G, E, G, C, C, B flat, C, G, E, G, C, C, B flat, right? Between all of the strings here, from the double bass to the first violins. I cross out the doublings. I end up with C, G, E, and B flat, just as I predicted for note names, right? If I am to arrange them as superimposed thirds, right? Right now, for example, if I'm only ascending, what I have is a fifth, then a sixth, and then a diminished fifth here. Right? So I'm putting things down an octave and unscrambling them in a way where I am left with notes that are each of those C, G, E, and B flat are a third apart. So the way to do that then is C, E, G, B flat. Now, each of those notes are a third apart from each other, right? So this is the seventh chord in root position, C, E, G, B flat, the root being C. So we know this is a C seventh chord. Now we have to figure out what kind. C, E, G make up a major triad, and then C to B flat, that type of seventh, is a minor seventh. There are 10 semitones between C and B flat. Therefore, a major triad and a minor seventh between root and seventh makes up for a major minor seventh chord, or in other words, a dominant seventh chord. So this is a C dominant seventh chord. Now that we know what it is, we just have to look at the lowest note here, which is given to us here in the bass clef. The C is repeated, so we don't leave the C. The C being held here as a lowest note indicates that this is in root position because C is a root of this chord, right? It sounds kind of like this. All right? And then it repeats and repeats in crescendos and diminuendos as it does. So this is C7, a C dominant seventh chord. Okay, thanks a lot for watching. Next, we'll talk about chords in major keys.